Section 6. The ontological divide based on two sensory modes. In this last section, I want to argue that the ontological division between Carlton world and Witten world, which I've introduced, can be related to the idea that we have two distinct channels for receiving sensory input from the external world. This idea is a prominent feature of Whitehead's ontology, but it can also be found in the work of the British psychologist Nicholas Humphrey. Humphrey makes a distinction between perception and sensation. Sensations, he says, belong to the subject. They are owned in a direct and personal way. Sensations are always tied to specific body sites. In other words, they're anchored in space and time and firmly located in the brain's map of the body. Sensations are modality specific, meaning that they are always experienced as a sight, sound, touch, taste, or smell. Sensations exist always and only in the present tense. And finally, taken all together, these characteristics mean that sensation marks a boundary between me and not me. It tells us what's happening to me rather than what's happening in the environment. So sensation and perception provide two completely separate and distinct channels from the environment to the brain. This distinction between perception and sensation can be characterized as the difference between our constructed conceptual model of the world and the experiential feelings which we receive from the world. The difference between how the world looks in the mental sense of understanding and how it feels in the sense of how we react to it. Sensation in single-celled organisms. Humphreys sees sensation as evolutionarily earlier than perception. Sensation arose in unicellular organisms, which are capable of responding to direct stimulation of their membrane boundaries by, for example, temperature, pressure, and chemical changes. Unicellular organisms avoid toxins and damagingly high temperatures and pressures while moving toward nutrients. They are also making evaluations of these sensations, positive or negative. They then react, according to Humphrey, with a wriggle of acceptance or rejection. Clearly, these simple organisms can sense or feel their environments, though in the absence of brains and nervous systems, conventional science currently has no idea how they do this. As we have seen, Whitehead's answer is that the experiential components of all things have the causal power to enable microorganisms to feel their environment as it impinges on them. Perception, on the other hand, developed evolutionarily later when the distant sensory modes of vision and hearing became important in more complex creatures such as ourselves. Via vision and hearing, perception enabled sophisticated creatures to answer the question, what's happening out there? So Humphreys argues that sensations originated in our primordial ancestors' expressions of liking or aversion. and that these evaluating inputs represent the most primitive and basic form of affect. This gels very well with the ideas of the neurophysiologists Jacques Panksepp and Antonio Damasio, to the effect that consciousness, and especially sensation, is important for homeostasis and affect regulation, leading to the highest forms of well-being. Comparing Humphreys and Whitehead's two sensory modes. I'm going to argue that when describing our two separate sensory modes, Whitehead and Humphrey are more or less talking about exactly the same phenomena. One of Whitehead's modes consists of what we can call the ordinary conception of perception, in which the external world is represented in the brain via our sense organs. This, therefore, corresponds to what Humphreys calls perception, what's happening out there. Whitehead calls his second and more profound mode of sensory perception prehension. In this mode, we directly perceive other actualities and sense them to be capable of exerting causal efficacy on us. Prehension is all about interacting with the world. I'm equating Whitehead's prehension mode with Humphrey's sensation, brackets, what's happening to me. Sensation as the basis of consciousness. But why do we need two channels for information to pass from the environment into the organism? Why shouldn't we just have one with bottom and top levels, as more conventional theorists believe? The answer, according to Humphrey, is that perception enables us to carry out all the functions necessary for survival and reproduction. The functions which many modern philosophers and scientists are keen to tell us can be carried out without consciousness. And indeed, Cartanism ignores or denies sensation, sentience, and qualia. So for those who don't dismiss sensation, the question becomes, why do we have it? Whittam's answer is that sensation is the basis of consciousness. And as we shall see, consciousness does have important biological functions. Causation as a basis for sensation. Whitehead introduced the notion that causation is an important factor for our receipt of sensory input from our environment. It forms the basis for the second and more profound of his two sensory modes, namely prehension or perception in the mode of causal efficacy. Humphrey comes remarkably close to this when he claims that sensation, such as seeing red, is a kind of action, something we do. It doesn't just happen to us. Humphrey's action account of sensation, as well as having much in common with Whitehead's causal efficacy, is also similar to the position of other alternative theorists, such as embodiments theories' notion of basic perception as enaction. In other words, seeing red is not a process of passively receiving impressions, such as certain wavelengths of light, or constructing internal images. It is something we actively do. Humphrey invents the intransitive verb redding as the name for this active first-person response. This lets him draw attention to the important fact that when we experience something red, we do not just learn something about it, we learn something about ourselves. Roughly, this thing provokes reading in me. Putting sensation on the production side of the mind, rather than the reception side, has, Humphrey argues, some quite unexpected and exciting implications. Sensation ought to be especially susceptible to top-down influences, which are controllable by the person, or to being altered by drugs, which helps make sense of imagery and hallucinations. We can compare this account from Humphrey with a description of Whitehead's perception in the mode of causal efficacy. Quote, I push and the world pushes back. If I am struck, I feel the presentational immediacy of pain constructed by my nerves and brain, but I experience that pain with and arising out of the physical causal energy of what strikes me, end quote. The suggestion here is that a flying rock, for example, carries a physical force, and that it is this force or energy which causes the sensory experience of the impact. Quote, I experience the pain with and because of that causal energy, end quote. This, it seems to me, is a very profound break with Cartan World's mode of perception, which is based exclusively on information processing. In that model, we may feel the presentational immediacy of pain constructed by my nerves and brain, but fail to experience that pain with and arising out of the physical causal energy of what strikes me. Intentionality. The philosophical concept of intentionality is defined by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as the power of minds to be about, to represent, or to stand for things, properties, and states of affairs. Intentionality, in this philosophical sense, is the basis of Cartan World's theory of representation, i.e., that a particular symbol embodied in a physiochemical brain state stands for or represents, for example, an object in the environment. Let me say immediately that I don't doubt that such processes occur in the brain in a very similar way as they do in a computer, as Dennett is wont to point out. What I don't accept is the Cartanist claim that these processes account for the entirety of human perception. What this Cartan model leaves out is qualia, everything from pain to the color red. I do not believe that these qualic experiences are the result of information processing and or representation in the brain. Dennett is at least a consistent inhabitant of Cartan World in the sense that he denies that qualia exist. Rather, qualia are, as above, experiential feelings which we receive from the world, and the way in which we receive them is via what Whitehead calls perception in the mode of causal efficacy, or more conveniently, prehension. Two sensory modes. As above, I want to conclude that the two sensory modes identified by Whitehead and Humphrey can be linked to the ontological worldviews I've described. I'd like to suggest, firstly, that in the Cartanist worldview, our sensory input is limited exclusively to what I've described here as the perception mode. This can be explained by pointing out that the perception mode is centered around the distance sensory modes, vision and hearing, and addresses the question, what's happening out there, rather than what's happening to me. Consequently, rather than the causation and action elements involved in the sensory mode, perception depends on information processing only, which makes it the mode of choice for computational theories of the mind and consciousness. And theories of this type are part of the core beliefs in the Cartanist worldview. This is why Cartanism limits itself to traditional and conventional theories of epistemology and perception. Witten world, on the other hand, fully accepts the sensation mode of perception. An important point to make here is that Wittemism also recognizes the functional aspects of perception. In other words, Wittenism is a higher level ontology, which recognizes most of Cartanism as a special case, covering a limited range of phenomena. Much as in quantum mechanics, classical physics is a special case covering a limited area. Wittemism unequivocally accepts the reality of qualia and affect. It sees them as arising from Whitehead's experience-based process philosophy. Wittemism is thus capable of encompassing such recent innovations as the suggestion from neurophysiologists that consciousness may be an extension of homeostasis, and the notion of autopoiesis, or self-organization, as espoused by embodiment and emergence theorists. A function for consciousness, ? Rejecting Cartanism's epiphenomenalism, Humphrey does argue that consciousness has a function. He suggests that qualic sensation provides important evolutionary benefits in terms of motivation, making people care more about their lives and selves. Wittemism agrees with this, but very significantly amplifies it. Given its belief that consciousness is based much more on affect than intelligence, Wittemism argues that the function of consciousness, rather than command and control of everyday behavior, is to adapt the infant mind to the psychosocial physical environment it finds itself born into. The infant must be conscious of its sensations of the world, and it must be conscious of its affective reactions to these sensations if these potentially lifelong adaptations are to be effectively established. Later in life, the results of this deep learning generally slips into the unconscious, but consciousness is necessary when they are being laid down. In adult life, this guidance from affective consciousness is exercised via what Panksepp calls seeking. This primordial emotion provokes organisms to explore their environment in order to satisfy their needs. In addition, Damasio points out that organisms avoid pain and seek pleasure. Both of these suggestions are very consistent with Humphrey's notion of motivation. All these notions suggest that affective consciousness can be seen as the highest stage of homeostasis. In conclusion, then, the function which Wittemism claims for consciousness can be summarized as adapting the infant mind and the guiding of adult behavior.